Hi, I'm Mike, and welcome to Working with React in D3. I'm going to show you how to make data visualization components and throw them right into your React app. You can think of them like drag and dropped dashboard components. And look at this, you can even make it responsive. D3 is pretty cool. It's kind of intimidating at first, but then you realize that really what D3 is it's building everything from the ground up. You can go right to the code repo that's in the description and just look over the code and kind of figure it out from there. Or follow me every step of the way. I won't skip anything, and you'll see how it's done. One thing to note is D3 is DOM manipulation, so is React. So at some point, someone may come along and say there's a better way to do this, but as we can see, it works. And it's pretty fun. So let's get right into it. First step, create a new React app. I'm not going to show you how to do that right here, but I have a video in my videos that shows you how to do this step. Get to this screen. Now, we are in the newly created React app. We're going to import D3. So we're going to do npm install D3. Now, while D3 is loading, I'm going to show you a little bit of the file structure that I have already completed. Okay, D3 loaded, so let's just do npm start so that all of our changes get propagated right to our screen here. I did a little bit of work beforehand. When you do the Create React app, you will get this file structure. Within source, you're going to have your app.js, that's what we'll be editing. And then you'll have, I made a folder called charts. Within charts, I made 3 files: Histogram.js, linechart.js, timeseries.js. Here they are. I have not changed app.js. Line chart, these are all the same, as you see here, and I just did a little boilerplate. This is just empty components. So go ahead and do that now if you're following along every step. Create these empty components, they're all the same. And now let's import them into our app. I'm going to drag and drop so you don't have to watch me type a bunch. So we're importing line chart from our charts/line chart, time series, histogram. We're going to get rid of everything in the app.js div, and we're just leaving this outer wrapper div. And now I am going to make another div. Let's do class name equals row. And in app CSS, I'm going to add row. We're going to do display, flex, flex, wrap. This allows our components to be responsive. So it'll show it'll render our components as a row, and then as the screen shrinks, it will throw it into columns. Okay, and that's it for CSS. No more, that's all we're doing. Everything else is just within our components. Okay, app.js, we have our components imported. Let's start working on the line chart. So let's use line chart here. We're going to give it a height and a width, specified here. We'll pass these in as props. How do you spell height? Let's just say 400 pixels tall, and let's do a width of 400 as well. Close our component here. So now that means we should render an empty line chart. Nothing is there. Should have a blank screen when we go here. Excellent. Okay, let's go into line chart. First thing we're going to do with our line chart, you notice here we're importing all as D3 from D3 for our line chart, so that's how we get D3 library into here. First thing we're going to do is set a couple things. We're going to pull our width and height components or variables from the props. So you see here, width and height get set from the props that we set here. Now, data, set data. I am going to pull data into this component right now within the component itself. You could pass the data in as props, but I'm gonna do it here just so that this whole chart component is like just this one self-contained thing. It's probably not best practice, but this is just for the sake of having it all in one place right now, and so we're not generating a bunch of files. So first thing I want to do is I want to get data to visualize. This is just a random data generator. What this is going to do, this little function that I dropped into here called generate data, we start off, basically what we're doing is we start off with an empty array, and then we're going to walk, it's going to be an array of objects, and you'll see here the labels. It's going to be label and value. The labels will increment from 0 to 20, and the values will do like a random walk upwards, and that's what this math random times I plus 3. That means essentially we're picking a random number, multiplying it by our I, which is our incrementer, 0 to 20, and then adding 3. So it kind of ensures that we have a random walk upwards. So for our line chart, it'll just be a kind of more interesting visualization to see. So what we do is we loop through I from 0 to 20. We end up with this data structure of objects within an array. And then we set that data using our use state to the data element, our data variable. So now our data, once this generate data function completes, our data element will have this random data. But how do we call generate data? We need generate data to actually call, and right now we're not calling it anywhere. So what we're going to do is use the use effect in React. Use effect fires when the component is mounted, and then also whenever this variable down here is updated. So if we leave this array empty from use effect, when we leave this empty, use effect will only fire once when the component mounts. But if we add a variable in there, whenever data is set by the set data function, then use effect will fire again. So what we're going to do is when the component mounts and every time data is updated, we will check if data has any kind of length, which means, is there data, then we'll draw the chart. Otherwise, we'll generate data. So that means the component will mount. There is no data yet, so it will generate data. Generate data will fire. Data will be updated. Therefore, use effect will fire again. And then it will say, hey, there's data this time. Let's draw the chart. So let's draw the chart. So this is the actual D3 bit. So we'll build this a little slower because this is what we're here for. All right, and what we're gonna do first is div ID, let's just say container. This is where it gets a little hairy because we are gonna use D3 to find this div. And so we do want these to be fairly unique divs down here. But this is the whole thing with D3 and React that I found, is that I looked at a bunch of tutorials, and most tutorials kind of follow the same process. So this process that I'm going to do right here should work with a lot of tutorials. Like you can adapt the tutorial to fit into your React app using this pattern of creating a div, and then within draw chart we will select this div and do our our DOM manipulation on this div. So a little more boilerplate. I know, so much fun. Margins, we got to set our margins. This will ensure that we can actually see stuff. So the SVG that we're going to create will clip anything outside of it. So we do need to have margins, and just 10 and 50 pixels. We are also going to use a D3 min and max function here. You see D3 min, D3 max. These are used to get the Y min values and the X min values, and the Y max and the X max values out of our data. So you see here for a Y min value, just for an example, we call D3.min, pass the data in, and then do this kind of anonymous function where essentially D3 min will loop through every data element of data, the value, and it will return the minimum value. And so that will return the y minimum value. And we do that with all the x and y maxes. And that is basically to set our chart ranges, because D3 does not automatically know how big you want your chart. We're setting everything from scratch with D3. So let's actually start creating some chart space. So next thing we're going to do is this create chart area. This is where we're going to create an element called SVG. It's going to be D3.select container. So we're selecting this div container in the DOM. We're appending an SVG, and then we're going to set that SVG's width and height, and we're using the width and height that we passed in through the props, and then also we're adding on the margins so that the total SVG size is our specified width and our margins. Then we're going to append a group, and we're going to transform translate, which means we're moving the chart area relative to the parent div. And we should not see anything yet. What's your problem? I did a bad thing. Yep, we don't see anything yet because all we've done is we haven't given any color or drawn anything inside of our SVG. So I think we can actually, skip it. We'll see where this shows up. Once we start drawing stuff, it'll make sense. Okay, next we're going to create the X scale. This is not the X axis yet. This is just the scale that the X axis will be on. And so we do D3 scale linear. You could say scale log or scale band if it's categories. But our labels, our X axis 0 to 20, are numerical, so we'll scale it linear. The domain is the min and max values. You know, our X axis could be zeroed at something other than 0, and which in this case it will be the minimum value all the way up to the max value. Then the range here, this dot range, this is essentially maps the domain to a pixel size, because your D3 doesn't know yet how big you want this X scale to be, actually like rendered on the screen. So we're telling it, hey, if our X max value, we know our width is 400, so we've passed the range is 0 to 400, so 0 pixels to 400 is how big we want our X scale to be on the screen. And the range will map the domain into that 0 to 400. So if our X max value is 20, it will map 20 to 400 pixels width, so that the 0 will be at the 0 and the 20 will be at our max width of the chart area. And we're going to do the same thing for the y-axis, essentially, so that the height, the max y value, gets mapped to the height of the chart. So you see here, everything is customized. You're in control of every single thing, whether you like it or not, with D3. SVG. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create the X grid. So at this point, we're going to see a grid now on the screen. I'll just show you what it looks like. So you see here now we have our width. This is the general chart shape. So the X grid, those vertical lines, we're creating a group. We're calling it, we're attribute class, it's a grid. And then we are transforming it so that it moves where we want it to. And we can mess around with that to see how you can kind of move that grid around your chart area. Then we're doing call D3 axis bottom X scale, tick size, and tick format. This is setting that actual X grid on the screen itself. Then we do Y grid. And now you see it's the same thing essentially. Class, grid, call, D3, axis, left, Y scale. Now we have an X and a Y grid. Now we can actually show an axis on the bottom. So this here is SVG append to group, attribute class, x-axis, transform translate down to the bottom by giving it the full height. It starts at the top, so if I didn't give it the 400 pixels that the height holds, then it would actually render this bottom x-axis on the very top of the chart. Then we're calling D3 axis bottom, scale it to the X scale, give ourselves a tick size. I don't even think we have to give ourselves a tick size, but now you can see that we have axis labels on the x-axis. Then we can do that with the y-axis. Save it, and as you see here, y-axis now. Now we want to draw our line. Before we draw the line, we're going to specify what the line kind of is. So we're going to say const line equals d3.line, and then we're doing a dot x and a dot y and a curve. The x and the y are essentially going to be mapped to the data elements. So every data element will have an x and a y mapped to it, to its position. But that doesn't draw it yet. The drawing of the line actually happens next. That just gives it the x and the y coordinates. You see here, this line is plugged into down here. So what we do now is we do SVG append path, datum, pass in data. What datum does is it takes every data element within data, and it will create, we've appended path, so essentially we're creating a path element for every piece of data. And then we're filling with none. We're doing a stroke with a color. We're doing a stroke width, and then class line attribute D, throw in the line. So this data maps every element here. And when you pass in line, that's why this little anonymous function with D works, because these actually exist down here now, and so they're getting the data from this dot datum. So now you will have a, what do you mean return? Oh, wrong bracket. Okay, now we have our line drawn. So let's just see like this curve. What happens when we don't include this curve? How does that render? It's a little sharper. I actually like that curve. We'll keep it. And then you notice we're generating random data each time. So every time the component reloads, it's calling that generate random data again. So we're getting a random walk upward, and that's why each chart is different. And the very end, I'll just actually, yeah, I'll complete it. I'll give it a header. We'll give it a header. I'm just doing a H4, header 4, line chart, static fake data, and then the a link to the original tutorial that I adapted this from. And here's the first chart. Okay, so next up is the time series. Okay, we've drawn our line chart. Now let's draw our time series. Time series, it's going to be a lot similar to the line chart. We're going to set a couple things before we start drawing and creating our chart. We are going to establish what our where we're going to get the data. So we've got a URL that leads to a CSV on GitHub. This is it came from the original tutorial that I adapted this from, but this is like the price of Bitcoin for a few years ago. We're going to set our width and height from the props. So again, within app.js, let's call our time series component And let's set the height and width just like we did with the line chart. Okay, so we're setting the height and width from props, and then we're going to have data and the set data function. So again, when the component mounts, we will run a use effect. The use effect will check. Use effect checks every time the component mounts and every time data is updated, use effect will run. And it'll check, hey, is there data here? If not, if there is data, let's draw the chart. If there's no data, let's go get the data from our getURLData function. Our getURLData function, let's throw it in here. So what this is doing, this getURLData is doing, is it is going out, it's calling this CSV from this URL using this D3.csv function. And then it does a little manipulation, and in whatever you kind of manipulation you want. In this case, we are parsing to get a date time from the first value, and then a float from the second element. And then we're setting that array into set data. And what you end up with is an array of objects that will look like this. You'll have an array. Each object will be a date with a value. And I'll show you. This is that URL, and you see here it's date, value, dates, and values. And so what we're doing is we're using this D3 to parse and actually tell D3, hey, this is a date. And that way, when we do our x-axis, it will be smart enough to know that it's a time series. And then we're giving it float values. So getURLData will fire off. We will set data. That will make use effect fire again. Data will be here now, so data will have a length. And so therefore, it will draw the chart. So let's draw the chart. Okay, what are we going to do in here? Well, same thing as before. We do want to establish some margins. Okay, establish margins. Then, just like before, we're going to create the chart area. We do need to make a div down here. Div ID equals time series. So now, we're going to create an SVG equals D3.select time series. Select this div. Then append with an SVG. And then set its width, its height, and then move it around wherever we want to, relative to whatever div it's inside of. Now we're going to set the x-axis. So I just added, just like before in line chart, we had x scale. This time I'm just calling it x. We could call this whatever we want, but we're doing a scale time. So our x scale, x equals d3.scale_time. So we're passing in our date from our data, and so it's going to scale time from our minimum value to our max. And our domain, again, takes the min and max values. Instead of doing a pre-calculated min and max value, this time I'm showing you that you can use d3.extent. d3.extent will loop through your data, and it will return an array of the min and max values. So it returns an array of min max values. So it'll be like x min, comma, x max. And therefore it fits right into the domain. And then again, setting the range to be from 0 pixels to 400 pixels mapped to that x min and max. Then here we actually create the axis itself. So we do SVG append group, move it to the bottom of the chart, and then call D3 axis bottom using x. So now if we save, we will have an empty chart with an x-axis at the bottom. Beautiful. So this would be the Bitcoin price from 2014 to 2018 roughly. Okay, now we can do the same thing with our y-axis. Again, scale linear. This time we want our chart, our y domain minimum value to be 0. We want our basically our y values to be centered at 0. And then we're calling the max on the data. So go from 0 to max. And again, for our range, we want it to be 0 to 400 pixels, our height. And then we're setting that on the left side. SVG append group, call D3 axis left using Y. So now we get our Y axis with labels. Brilliant. Now we draw our line, and just like before, this is how we're going to draw our line. We establish our line. X and Y are going to be mapped to date and value for X and Y. Then we do SVG append path, datum, pass in the data again, give it no fill, give it a stroke color of steel blue, give it a stroke width, attribute D, throw in that line element. So now it will be graphed. And look at that. So you can see how, let's stroke width, let's just pump this up to something ridiculous just so like you can see the kind of customization you can do. Yeah, whatever you want, you can do it. But that was kind of ugly, so let's not do that. So that is, oh, and then the final touch, let's throw in our header. Again, this is just a header, time series, HTTP CSV response, and then the link to the original tutorial that I inspired this one. And there you go. And then remember, they're responsive now too. So as your screen shrinks, you can, because we have flex display wrap, they're like drag and drop components. So cool. Okay, we've done our time series. Let's do the histogram. Histogram. Same thing as all the others at this point. You don't even need me anymore. Let's do a couple things up front. We are going to get, again, our width and height from props. Again, this will be the URL. I'll show you what this URL goes to. Oh, what is that? What is all this? I just wanted something, I just found a random API. I wanted to, we did random data for the time, for the line chart. We got a CSV from a URL for our time series. This time, I wanted to show what we could do with like some kind of API response in a JSON format. This is some random brewery database API. It's just returning a bunch of data about breweries inside of its database. And let's say we've got our, our business question is inside of our API response, or inside of whatever. We've got this API response. I want to know how many breweries are in each state. So this has, if we can find it somewhere in here, here we go, like state Oregon. So every data entry in this API, every JSON element has the state that the brewery is in. So we're just gonna go through this JSON response, count each time each state was mentioned, and then display it graphically as a histogram so that you can easily see the frequency of the states and see like their relative frequency against the other states in the API response. So we've got our URL, again, data, set data. We're gonna call it all from here. We're gonna do the same thing we've been doing. We're gonna use the use effect functionality to fire off when the component mounts, and then have it fire off after we call set data. And it's going to check, is there data? If there is, draw the chart. If there's no data, let's go get it. So there's no data, so let's go get it. Okay, get URL data. This time, we need to make it an async function because it takes a little bit of time to get that API response. So we're gonna call, let's say we've got our URL response equals await fetch JSON URL. So go use the built-in fetch. Then let's do JSON result. We take that URL response and convert it to JSON. Now down here, we're gonna essentially what we're gonna do down here in this code block is no wonder. Sorry. It's not quite finished yet. Okay. So this code block right here, what we're doing is we're starting off with an empty dictionary. We're going to loop through every element of the JSON response, and we're going to count every state, and we're going to push it into this dictionary. So for every time it reads an Oregon, it's going to use the Oregon key and say, hey, is this Oregon key greater than 0? If it is, great, increment by 1. If Oregon key is less than 0, then or equal to 0, then let's start it off with a value of 1. So basically this accounts for, you're looping through and you get to a state that you haven't counted yet, or you get to a state that you've already counted. You're either incrementing or starting it off as the first count. Then what you have is a dictionary of Oregon equals 5, Arizona equals 2, Washington equals 1. What we want to do though is push that into an array of objects. And so that's what this does down here. We've got state frequency array equals object.keys state frequency dot map function key return state key frequency, the state frequency key value. So basically that's a lot, but we're taking the key value pairs of our dictionary and pushing them into objects of an array. So what we end up with is an array with a structure like this, where you've got an array with objects. Each object is a state, Idaho, comma, frequency 1. And you would also get an object where it would say state, what was it? Oregon frequency 5. So an array of objects. We pushed our dictionary of key value pairs, state with frequencies, into an array of objects. Then we are calling these set data. So we're taking that array and we're setting it to the data element, a variable, which will fire off use effect again. One thing you'll notice, I did call sort on this array because I want the states with the highest frequency at the front of the array, because for our visualization, it'll make it easier to interpret. So now data is getting set with our array of states and frequencies, and then use effect will fire again, and it will check, hey, is there data this time? Yes, there is. So let's draw the chart. Okay, const draw chart. Okay, very similar to before with our chart drawing. We're gonna have a margin. This one has a little bigger margins. You'll notice 70s and 50s because the state names themselves are longer than just these simple little, these simple labels down here. So we need a little more room. Okay, and you're very used to this by now. Let's create an SVG equals D3.select histogram. Let's throw our histogram in here. Div ID equals histogram. Now, append that histogram with an SVG. Let's give it a background color of white, but I'm going to do black for now so we can actually see it. Then set its width and height, and then move it around where we want it moved to. Okay, again, creating the X scale, and so this time our X scale is a band, scale band. Scale band is for, we're using this for categorical values because our X scale is not like a time series where it's all numerical dates or integers like our line chart. It's categories, it's state names. So what it's doing is we're going to map the domain to all the state category names. So our X scale will just consist of our state names. And then we're giving it the range of our margin left and our margin right. So it's not necessarily mapping. Well, yeah, each state name will have a place in the pixels between the left and right margins. And the Y scale, though, is numerical values. So this will look similar to what we've been doing. Again, it's just a scale linear, 0 to the max. Now, this is something new. We're going to give our bars colors. So each bar will have a color. And we're going to use this bar colors equals D3 scale linear. And again, it's going to be a 0 to a frequency max in our data. But the range, instead of being pixels, it's going to be colors. So essentially 0 will be blue and max will be red. And it will, whatever number you throw into bar colors, it will return something in the range between blue and red. Either all blue or something in between, if it's a middle value, all the way to red if it's the max value. Now let's throw in our x-axis because we have the x scale. Now let's actually assign it the axis. So we see here SVG append group transform call D3 axis bottom x scale. What did I just do? There we go. Okay, I think honestly, we should be seeing a lot of stuff on the screen now, so. We didn't add it into the app. That's why we have nothing. So, just like before, histogram, height and width, call it here in the app. We've already imported it. Now we can save, and look at that, we got that black background we were waiting for. Let's turn that white again so that we can actually see. Great, and now we can see our state names. Okay, the reason, so you see here, beautiful. What this is down here is, let's get rid of this. So when we just do the x-axis, our state names are all garbled together. We can't understand them. So what we do is we add on a little bit more. And so we do select all text. So we set the x-axis, and then we select all the text of the x-axis. We anchor it, we give it some x and y coordinates, very small, but really, really important here is just this transform rotate 65 degrees. This is how it goes from garbled, jarbled, can't read it, to tilted 65 degrees. And you know, the anchor and the x and y offsets make it so that it's just really nicely aligned there, and you can read it. It looks great. Now the y-axis, this will be familiar. Similar as before, just y-axis, call D3 axis left. And now you will see, using that y scale, we have our 0 to max value. Great, and then let's throw in the bars. The bars are a little bigger chunk, as you will see. So the bars. Create bars, const bars equals svg.selectAllRecs. You probably remember, as we've been building this, our SVG, we have not added any rectangles yet. What we're doing is we're selecting all rect. There are none. We bind them all to each data element. There's many data elements, but still no rectangles. But that's what the enter function does. This enter here, this looks at the data, says, oh, you want a rect for every data element. I got you. It does it, and then we append those recs to the SVG. So enter here does that for us. Then we set our X and Y attributes of each data element. And the X scale, it takes the state. And remember, our X scale that we set up here, it has a mapping of every state to a place in the pixel width. And so when you give it a state name, it knows which pixel location that you want for that state name. And so that's why you can set a bar to be at X coordinate on the X scale. And the same with Y. You can set the Y coordinate to the Y scale with the frequency. Then we're going to give the bars a width, give it a height. The height is basically 0 minus the frequency. So it actually draws the height like kind of in reverse, but every bar's height is set by its frequency, the frequency value of the data. And then we got some style, some padding, some margin, some width, and then we've got attribute fill. This fill attribute right here, we pass into bar colors the data.frequency. This will return that color between blue and red, depending on how high or low this frequency is. And then we give it a little stroke black, stroke width. But this will draw our bars. And as we see here, our bars are drawn. The heights are set according to the frequency. The state, they know where to go on the x-axis, and the colors go from blue to red depending on min to max values. Let's finish it off with a little header. This one is the JSON response. All right, and there you have it, all three chart elements, responsive, and now you can see how you can kind of adapt any other or most of the other D3 tutorials or chart examples that someone else has made, and that's kind of how you adapt it into a React app. Okay, have fun building. Thanks for joining me.